Summer 1943. Heat shimmered above the fields of northern France, where dust and silence had settled in uneasy partnership. The war had already stripped the land of its rhythm, leaving villages skeletal, orchards trampled, and barns hollowed into storage for whatever army passed through next. On a humid afternoon, 3 German prisoners of war were herded into a makeshift compound fashioned from barbed wire and American ingenuity, an enclosure of wire strung on posts, with watchtowers that looked hastily built, yet stood as symbols of permanence. For men who had been raised on the German doctrine of precision and order, there was something unsettling about the casual strength of American improvisation. It seemed almost careless, and yet it worked. Hans Muller was the first to step inside, his boots dragging across gravel that seemed deliberately chosen to make noise, as though even the ground wanted to remind him of captivity. He was 24, broad-shouldered from years as a farmhand before conscription, with a sharp tongue that often landed him in trouble with officers. War had worn his cynicism into habit. He distrusted almost everything, especially hope. Behind him came Kurt Weiss, older at 32, his face framed by streaks of dust that highlighted lines already etched deep by grease and engine smoke. A mechanic before he was a soldier, Kurt had a habit of staring at machines longer than men, as though pistons and gears might offer truths that people never could. The youngest was Friedrich Adler, only 19, his cheeks still carrying a softness that made him look misplaced in uniform. His eyes, too wide, too eager, made the others uneasy. They all knew boys like him didn't last long in war. The 3 men had been captured near Sicily, swept up in the Allies' surging campaign that threatened to gut the Mediterranean flank. Their transfer to this camp in France felt less like punishment than erasure, as though they were being filed away into some forgotten drawer of the war machine. Hans muttered bitterly, "So this is it, a cage built on foreign soil. Rommel must be proud." His words dripped with irony, but the others heard the weight underneath. They had been soldiers of the Afrika Korps once, clinging to the desert myth of invincibility. Now they were reduced to watching the war from behind fences, their faith rusting as quickly as the rifles stripped from their hands. From their corner of the compound, they could glimpse the road beyond. At first it seemed ordinary, dusty, lined with hedgerows, stretching toward villages whose church spires pierced the haze. But the road became its own kind of stage. American trucks thundered along it in endless succession, olive-drab giants snarling with exhaust, their tarpaulin covers bulging like bellies stuffed with invisible treasures. The convoys moved with a rhythm so steady it unnerved the prisoners, like a river refusing to dry. Hans squinted through the wire, counting trucks until the numbers blurred. "It's absurd," he muttered. "Where do they get them all?" Kurt chuckled without humor. "From factories the size of our cities. You think Germany could dream of this? No. We build dreams out of shortage. They build out of abundance." Friedrich, too naive to mask his awe, whispered, "They sound like thunder, like a storm that doesn't stop." The Americans guarding them seemed almost indifferent. Many were barely older than Friedrich, lanky men with easy grins and accents that mangled French worse than German tongues ever had. They chewed gum incessantly, as though even their jaws needed to be busy. Hans sneered when he first saw them. Children in uniform, that's all. But there was a confidence in their looseness, a strange power in the way they slouched with rifles hanging casual at their sides, as if the weapons were accessories, not lifelines. It contrasted sharply with German rigidity, where every strap had to be aligned, every boot polished until it reflected authority. Here, authority seemed to bloom from abundance, from the sheer weight of resources that backed these young men. They didn't need to stand ramrod straight. They had thousands of trucks to stand for them. The first weeks passed with monotony. Meals were dull, but steady, beans, bread, sometimes meat. Nothing extravagant, yet far more than what German civilians now scraped together at home. Letters from families, if they came at all, spoke of ration cards and shortages, of black bread that grew thinner each month. Kurt read one such letter under the dim glow of a lantern and whispered to Hans, "My wife queues 6 hours for potatoes." Meanwhile, These Americans complain if the coffee isn't hot. Hans laughed bitterly. Coffee. For us, it's already a memory. For them, it's just Tuesday. The laughter died quickly, replaced by silence heavy with acknowledgement. War, they realized, was not just fought with rifles and tanks, but with kitchens, factories, and endless cups of coffee. Friedrich remained the most restless. At night, he asked questions the others didn't want to entertain. What if the Americans really cannot be stopped? What if their machines never run out? Hans snapped once. Every machine breaks. Every army falters. Don't let their noise fool you. But his words lacked conviction, and Friedrich noticed. The roar of engines outside their wire had already begun to carve its way into Hans's skepticism, grinding it down with every passing convoy. Even silence seemed impossible now, filled as it was with phantom echoes of trucks rolling into infinity. One afternoon, as the prisoners worked under guard repairing fences, a convoy slowed nearby. The dust kicked up by the wheels coated their tongues and lashes. Kurt, wiping grit from his face, noticed markings painted in bold letters across the lead truck, Red Ball Express. He repeated the words aloud, puzzled. The guards chuckled. One leaned on his rifle and said in broken German, "Our road never stops." The words lodged in Kurt's mind, rattling against the machinery of his thoughts. A road that never stopped. Such a thing belonged to fable, not war. And yet the evidence growled and belched smoke just meters away. That night, Kurt described it to Hans and Friedrich, his voice tinged with something they had not heard before, awe. They named their supply line like a carnival ride, and then they make it real. Do you understand? They don't just move supplies. They make a theater of it. Every truck is a declaration. Hans scoffed, though his eyes betrayed unease. So, a name changes nothing. It's still just gasoline and bread. Friedrich shook his head, whispering with almost religious tremor, "No, it's the sound. It's the feeling. It's as if the war belongs to them now." The camp grew accustomed to this rolling thunder. Days blurred, measured not by meals or mail, but by convoys. Trucks by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, rumbling toward horizons the prisoners could not see. The guards joked among themselves, betting how many vehicles would pass before nightfall, and the prisoners listened, silent, unable to shake the sense that each wheel turned against them personally. Even laughter became heavy. Once, when an American driver dropped a crate of oranges near the wire, Friedrich gasped as if witnessing a miracle. Fresh fruit, sunlit, fragrant, rolling across mud to the boots of men who hadn't tasted such sweetness in years. Hans caught one, stared at its bright skin, then hurled it away in fury. But the smell lingered, citrus mocking them with the taste of plenty. By late summer, word drifted in through guards' gossip. Patton's army was advancing faster than even his superiors had anticipated. The Germans, the guards said, couldn't keep up. Horses against engines, rail lines against convoys. Hans laughed hollowly. They think victory comes from wheels. Let's see how long wheels can fight. Yet the others noticed how often he stared at the road, his gaze chasing the trucks until they vanished in a heat shimmer. His sneer had softened into something else, fear, or perhaps recognition. As the sun set one evening, painting the compound in bruised shades of orange and violet, Friedrich asked softly, "Do you think they'll ever stop?" No one answered. The silence stretched, filled with the low, distant growl of another convoy approaching, another tide of iron and fuel, another reminder that their world had shifted. Even the crickets seemed to pause, as though conceding the night to engines. Hans finally spoke, his voice low, reluctant. Machines break. Roads end. They must. But his words felt like dust in the wind, carried off before they could take root. The others heard the doubt gnawing at his certainty. And as the first headlights pierced the dusk, swinging like ghostly lanterns down the endless road, all three men turned to watch. What they saw was more than trucks. It was the future, rolling toward them, unstoppable. What none of them could yet know was that this procession was only beginning, and its true power was still hidden. The Red Ball Express had not yet revealed its full weight, and when it did, The prisoner's disbelief would curdle into something far sharper. The realization that the war itself was being rewritten not by generals or battles, but by engines that never slept. August 1944. The sky above Normandy trembled with the echoes of war, but on the roads, a different kind of thunder rolled. It was not the crash of artillery or the snarl of tanks, but the steady, unbroken growl of engines. Day and night, convoys streamed forward in a procession that seemed to mock the very idea of scarcity. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, and for the prisoners who watched from behind wire, it became less a supply line than a revelation. Hans Muller pressed his face against the fence until the wire left marks across his skin. The trucks came in endless waves, 2.5 tons of steel, canvas, and certainty, each groaning with supplies that gleamed in his imagination. Crates of ammunition, drums of gasoline, sacks of flour. He had spent years believing German discipline could overcome American softness, that quantity without quality was a fatal weakness. But as the convoys roared by, his conviction thinned like smoke. There was something terrifying in the sheer monotony of abundance, in the way every truck looked like the one before it, as though mass production itself had become a weapon. Kurt Weiss stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not in awe but calculation. To him, each convoy was a machine larger than any engine he had ever repaired. 6,000 vehicles a day. He had overheard an American sergeant brag. 400,000 tons of supplies delivered in a season. Numbers that staggered the imagination. Numbers that turned battlefields into mathematical problems Germany could no longer solve. "It's not war," Kurt muttered once, almost reverently. "It's a factory on wheels." Friedrich Adler, younger and more transparent in his feelings, could not hide his astonishment. He pointed out the variety of trucks, some carrying gasoline drums stacked like towers, others bulging with food, others with spare parts for tanks that had not yet broken down. "They move as if the war cannot touch them," he whispered. His voice carried a strange mixture of fear and admiration, as though he were watching gods at work. The others offered no correction. They, too, felt the same shiver of recognition. This was something beyond the war they had trained for, something that belonged more to the century ahead than the one they thought they were fighting. The American guards, far from solemn about their miracle of motion, treated the convoys like an inside joke. They leaned against their rifles and called out bets on how many trucks would pass before supper. Some shouted nicknames for the drivers: Midnight Joe, Georgia Slim, Chicago Red. Most of those men behind the wheels were African-American soldiers, young men who bore a double burden. Second-class citizens at home, indispensable drivers here. The prisoners watched them with curiosity. In the Reich, such men would have been invisible, voiceless. Yet here they were, steering the arteries of an empire of abundance, laughing and singing as they worked. One driver caught Friedrich's attention. He was a wiry young man, no older than 22, his cap tilted back, a cigarette dangling from his lips as though it had grown there. Even under the weight of war, he carried himself with ease, tapping the wheel to some rhythm only he could hear. Once, when his convoy slowed near the camp, he tossed a stick of gum through the wire. Friedrich caught it, unwrapped it slowly, and chewed until the sweetness turned to rubber. He had never tasted anything like it. "They even fight with candy," he murmured. Hans scoffed, but his eyes betrayed envy. The Red Ball Express did not rest. At night, headlights were blacked out, leaving only slitted beams that sliced through fog and dust like ghostly fingers. From the compound, the prisoners could see those moving lights in the distance, as though stars had descended to earth and taken to the roads. It was both beautiful and maddening. Even sleep carried the sound of gears grinding, tires humming, engines coughing in unison. Silence had become impossible. The war had found a new soundtrack, and it belonged to America's wheels. Hans began to sense the collapse of something larger than battles. The German generals had preached that war was the test of discipline, strategy, and courage. Yet here was proof that war could be decided by trucks, that empires might fall not from lack of will, but from lack of gasoline. He hated the thought. It made him feel small, irrelevant, as though all his marching, fighting, and bleeding had been no more decisive than a wrench in Kurt's pocket. Kurt, meanwhile, seemed almost entranced. He studied the convoys like a scholar at a blackboard. They've turned logistics into an army of its own. He explained one evening, his tone hushed. Every truck is a soldier, every mile of road a battlefield. They don't need to outthink us. They only need to keep driving. There was admiration in his voice, but also despair, for a mechanic could not help but respect an engine, even when it belonged to the enemy. Friedrich, restless in his youth, allowed the spectacle to infect his imagination. He began sketching in the dirt with a stick, drawing convoys as endless lines, arrows pointing westward. They move like destiny, he said once, earning a glare from Hans. But the truth of it hung between them. Even the guards seemed aware that something extraordinary was unfolding. They joked about Patton's hunger for fuel, how the general would rather see men starve than tanks run dry. My soldiers can eat their belts, Patton had declared, but my tanks have got to have gas. The guards repeated the line like a punchline, but to the prisoners it sounded more like prophecy. One afternoon, rain lashed the camp, turning the earth to mud. The prisoners huddled under makeshift shelters, but the convoys did not slow. Tires hissed through puddles, fenders gleamed wet under the storm. Exhaust mixed with the smell of wet soil. The Americans rolled on, as if immune to weather itself. Hans watched in silence, and for the first time he admitted aloud, perhaps they really cannot be stopped. The words startled even him. Friedrich's eyes widened. Kurt gave a grim nod. The conviction of scarcity was beginning to crack. The Red Ball Express became their obsession. They spoke of it more than battles, more than home. The trucks were not just vehicles. They were proof of a world tilting away from them. At night, Hans dreamed of wheels crushing cities. Kurt dreamed of engines that never stalled. Friedrich dreamed of rivers of headlights stretching forever. Their captivity was no longer measured by days, but by convoys. As autumn approached, rumors filtered in. Patton's army was moving with unprecedented speed, slicing through France as if the land itself bent to his will. The Germans could not retreat fast enough. Their supply lines shattered while the Americans only grew stronger. The prisoners pieced it together, connecting the roar outside their wire with the maps they sketched from memory. They realized they were witnessing not just logistics, but a new philosophy of war. Speed was no longer a tactic. It was the strategy. One evening, as twilight draped itself across the compound, the convoys surged again, engines howling into the dusk. Kurt leaned against the fence, his face lit by the passing glow of headlights. "This is how empires fall," he murmured. "Not by bullets, by wheels." Hans said nothing. He could not. The truth had become too loud to deny. The last truck of that convoy bore a phrase painted in white across its canvas: "Hell on wheels." The words glared in the fading light, half boast, half omen. Friedrich shivered. The others followed the truck with their eyes until it vanished into the horizon. For a long moment, silence hung, broken only by the receding echo of engines. And in that silence lay the unspoken realization. What they had seen was only the beginning. The road itself had become a weapon, and its end was nowhere in sight. The summer roads of France no longer belonged to the countryside. They had become arteries, pulsing with motion, throbbing with fuel, and carrying the lifeblood of Patton's relentless advance. To the prisoners behind their wire fences, it seemed that every sunrise brought a new demonstration of speed, as though the Americans were competing not only with the Germans, but with time itself. What unnerved Hans Muller most was not the roar of tanks or the rattle of machine guns, but the sense that war itself had shifted its pace. Discipline and strategy were being outrun by something simpler: momentum. Patton's army moved with a hunger that seemed almost unnatural. Reports filtered in through the guards, scraps of gossip and headlines shouted from newspapers and mess tents. The general's tanks had advanced 100 miles in a single week, leaving German defenses in shambles. His soldiers joked they would fight the enemy with chewing gum and jeeps if the fuel ran out. But the fuel did not run out. The Red Ball Express saw to that, its convoys rushing forward like veins feeding a giant heart. Speed itself was the new weapon, and it struck harder than any artillery barrage. For Hans, this realization was suffocating. He remembered his training, the lectures drilled into him about German precision, about the brilliance of command that would always outmaneuver brute strength. Yet here he was watching a different truth. Every truck that passed mocked those lessons. What use was precision when the enemy could simply drive past your defenses before you'd even set them? One night, lying awake on his cot, he whispered into the dark, "Our war is already too slow." Neither Kurt nor Friedrich answered, but their silence confirmed they felt it too. Kurt, ever the mechanic, found himself staring at the convoys with something like reverence. "They treat engines like weapons," he explained one evening, his voice low but edged with excitement. "Not just machines to move men, but machines to break the enemy's rhythm. You don't realize how devastating that is until you see it." He gestured toward the endless growl of the road. "They've turned speed into artillery." His words unsettled Hans, not because they weren't true, but because they sounded dangerously like admiration. Friedrich's youth made him more open about his awe. He began to speak of the Americans with a kind of reluctant respect. "They fight differently," he said. "Not with ceremony, not with the weight of history, but with improvisation. Like jazz. Loud, chaotic, unstoppable." Hans nearly struck him for the comment, but the words stuck. Even Hans, hardened by skepticism, could not entirely dismiss the image. Improvisation, what Germans mocked as weakness, had become strength in this new kind of war. The sensory weight of the convoys never let them forget. The air stank of diesel and rubber. The ground quivered as if the earth itself had grown restless. Sometimes, at night, when headlights shimmered across the compound in passing streaks, the prisoners felt like shadows in a world that no longer belonged to them. Kurt confessed he dreamt of gears grinding endlessly, a machine that could not be stopped. Friedrich admitted that when he closed his eyes, he saw rivers of headlights stretching past the horizon. Even Hans, though he never admitted it, could not remember silence without the phantom hum of engines. Among the guards, the pace of Patton's advance became a source of jokes. They laughed about how their general seemed possessed by motion, how he would rather starve his men than slow his tanks. "Hell on wheels, that's what he calls his boys," one guard said with a grin. "And he means it." The prisoners listened with clenched jaws. There was something unbearable in the casual way the Americans spoke of their speed, as though it were not extraordinary at all, as though inevitability itself had taken human form. The convoys were not invulnerable. Drivers told stories of Luftwaffe strafing runs, of bombs cratering roads, of ambushes by desperate German troops. But even those dangers seemed swallowed by the sheer persistence of motion. A truck destroyed was quickly replaced. A convoy slowed was simply rerouted. Private Leroy Jackson, a wiry driver from Mississippi, once boasted to a guard near the compound, "We didn't stop for flat tires, didn't stop for breakdowns, didn't even stop for bombs. We just kept rolling." Friedrich overheard, and the words haunted him. How could an army fight an enemy that never paused to catch its breath? The irony was not lost on Kurt. Germany had prided itself on blitzkrieg, lightning war built on speed and shock. But now they were the ones stunned by lightning. "They've stolen our doctrine and made it bigger," he muttered bitterly. "Not blitzkrieg, but something even faster because it never ends. Lightning strikes once." He gestured at the road, where another convoy rattled past. "This is a storm without end." Hans tried to resist the creeping despair. He clung to sarcasm like a lifeline, sneering at the Americans' wastefulness, mocking their endless gum and cigarettes, their sloppy uniforms. But even he could not ignore the truth pressing in with every truck. Abundance had become invincible. He felt himself shrinking in its shadow, his once defiant posture sagging with each day. Sometimes he wondered if his own bitterness had become a kind of surrender. One evening, after a day of watching convoys, Hans snapped at Friedrich, "Do you enjoy this? Watching them? Cheering them in your head?" Friedrich did not flinch. His voice, though soft, cut sharper than Hans's anger. It's not about enjoying. It's about seeing what is real. We train to fight battles that no longer exist. The war has left us behind. Hans wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew the boy was right. As autumn deepened, the convoys grew heavier, faster, louder. Patton's tanks surged forward across France, fueled not just by gasoline, but by the unrelenting pulse of the Red Ball Express. Each rumor of German retreat confirmed what the prisoners already sensed. The front was dissolving, not because the enemy had outmaneuvered them, but because the enemy had outpaced them. The road itself had become a front line, and it was one Germany could not breach. For Kurt, the revelation was strangely personal. One night he confessed, "All my life I thought machines were servants, but here they command. The men serve the engines, and the engines serve the war. That is why we cannot win." The others listened in silence. His words stripped away the last comfort of denial. The compound, once a place of waiting, became a theater of witnessing. They were no longer soldiers but spectators to a war redefined. Each passing convoy hammered the truth deeper. The war was being fought not just with courage or strategy, but with velocity. To be slow was to be defeated. One night, as the prisoners stood by the fence, a convoy thundered past, headlights sweeping their faces. For a fleeting moment, Hans's reflection flashed in the glare, gaunt, weary, and uncertain. He felt as though he were staring at his own obsolescence. When the last truck passed, silence returned for a breath, heavy and absolute. Then, faintly, from the distance, another rumble began to rise. The sound was steady, unbroken, relentless. Friedrich turned, his voice trembling with both fear and wonder. "Do you hear it? They're already coming again." By winter, the roads of France no longer felt like roads at all. They had become something mythic, a ceaseless tide of engines and steel, more river than highway, more inevitability than motion. For the prisoners behind their fence, the Red Ball Express was no longer simply a supply line. It was a constant presence, a sound that replaced silence, a rhythm that replaced thought. It was not just that the convoys moved supplies, it was that they moved history itself, dragging the world forward whether anyone consented or not. Hans Muller stood at the wire one morning, frost biting at his cheeks, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in German victory. The memories were slipping, worn down by the endless drumbeat of wheels. He had once mocked the Americans as soft, convinced their abundance would rot them from within. But abundance had hardened them instead, given them a power beyond imagination. He wondered bitterly if the Reich had ever truly stood a chance against such factories, such numbers, such roads without end. Kurt Weiss, always a mechanic, spoke less now, but thought more. He no longer bothered sneering at the convoys. Instead, he studied them with grim focus, as though hoping to solve the puzzle before it crushed him completely. "They've made the machine their general," he muttered once, his eyes following the blur of wheels. "Patton commands men, but the machine commands Patton, and nothing can order it to stop." His words carried no admiration anymore, only the quiet resignation of a man who understood that the rules of war had been rewritten in grease and gears. Friedrich Adler, still young enough to believe in revelation, seemed transformed most of all. The boy who had once whispered, "On now," carried himself with the weariness of someone who had glimpsed a future his elders refused to admit. He no longer spoke of German victory at all. Instead, he listened, watched, absorbed. Each convoy etched a deeper mark on him, shaping his silence into something heavier than words. One evening, the guards brought news with unrestrained glee. Patton's tanks had surged through Lorraine, fueled by gasoline delivered in those very convoys. The German retreat had become a rout, lines collapsing not in battle, but in exhaustion. The prisoners said nothing, but the truth pressed into them like frost into stone. The Red Ball Express had done what no strategy could, turned speed into inevitability. The convoys themselves seemed to know their power. Trucks roared by with names painted on their sides. Lucky Lady, Hell on Wheels, Victory Wagon. Each felt like a taunt, like graffiti scrawled across the crumbling walls of the Reich. One truck rattled past with "Berlin or bust" splashed across its canvas, and Friedrich caught his breath. He realized the Americans were not simply delivering fuel. They were declaring destiny, truck by truck, mile by mile. Hans tried to fight the despair that gnawed at him. He reminded himself of Stalingrad, of how winter and will had broken armies stronger than these convoys. He clung to the belief that somewhere, somehow, Germany would strike back. But each day, the evidence eroded his defiance. The Reich had built its myth on iron discipline and ruthless efficiency. Yet here was proof that chaos harnessed to industry could outmatch order. It was a truth Hans could not bear, but one he could no longer deny. Kurt gave voice to what Hans could not. "We built soldiers. They built factories. Factories win." His tone carried neither anger nor grief, only exhaustion, as though the truth had hollowed him. He looked at his hands, scarred from years of repairing engines, and wondered aloud if he had spent his life on the wrong side of progress. The final blow came not in gunfire, but in spectacle. One afternoon, the convoys slowed near the camp, an unusual sight. The prisoners gathered, curious, and then saw why. Stretching beyond sight, truck after truck carried fuel drums stacked so high they seemed to teeter against the sky. The line was endless, a metallic serpent winding through France, feeding Patton's appetite for speed. The guards laughed and shouted, one calling out, "Enough gas to drive straight to Berlin." The words rang out like prophecy. Hans felt something break inside him then. Watching the serpent of steel and fire, he realized the war was already lost, not in the ruins of Stalingrad or the sands of Africa, but here, on these roads. The Reich had been defeated by tires and gasoline, by the refusal of engines to rest. He turned away from the sight, unable to bear it, but the sound followed him. The growl of the convoys seemed carved into the air, echoing even when silence returned. That night, sleep did not come. The compound lay in stillness, but the prisoners could hear the phantom hum of trucks in their dreams, as if the very earth now belonged to the Americans' rhythm. Kurt lay awake, whispering to no one, "The machine doesn't need rest. Only men do. That's why we lost." Friedrich, eyes open in the dark, thought of his generation, raised on myths of discipline, now watching the future ride past them on wheels. Morning brought frost and pale light, but the convoys did not pause. They rolled on, headlights cutting the mist, exhaust fumes curling into the air like banners of conquest. The prisoners lined the fence again, unable to look away, even as the sight hollowed them further. Each truck was a reminder, each will a verdict. The climax did not come with explosions or battles they could witness firsthand. It came with realization, quiet, undeniable, merciless. War had changed, and they had missed its transformation. Abundance had become strategy, motion had become doctrine, and speed had become the weapon that crushed them without firing a shot. Friedrich broke the silence as the latest convoy rumbled by. His voice was steady, almost calm, but it carried the weight of finality. "We were defeated the moment they started moving," he said. Hans closed his eyes, Kurt lowered his head, and neither man argued. The boy had spoken what they all knew, that the sound of engines had become the sound of defeat. The last truck in that convoy bore a phrase scrawled in bold white letters across its rear canvas: "The road never ends." The prisoners watched it vanish into the horizon, the words lingering in their minds long after the truck itself disappeared. It was boast and prophecy both, a promise that the road would roll on until the war itself was consumed. Hans gripped the fence until his knuckles whitened. He wanted to scream, to deny, to claw back some shred of defiance. But the engines drowned him out, their growl louder than his breath, louder than his rage. The war no longer listened to men like him. It listened only to wheels. And as the rumble faded into distance, replaced almost instantly by the rising growl of yet another convoy, the prisoners understood the full, merciless truth. History now traveled on rubber and gasoline, and there was no stopping it. The Red Ball Express had become not just Patton's lifeline, but the weapon that broke their world.